They were the kind of family people admired: a strong, disciplined soldier, a devoted wife, and a bright-eyed little boy who completed their world. A love story built on years of sacrifice, loyalty, and the promise that no matter how far duty called, home would always be waiting. But beneath the surface of that perfect image, something dark lurked. A secret so deep, so unforgivable, that when it finally surfaced, it shattered lives in an instant. What does it take to push a man to his breaking point? To strip away every ounce of restraint until there's nothing left but raw, unfiltered rage. This is a story of love turned to deception, trust turned to betrayal, and a moment of reckoning so violent it left a nation in shock. Before we dive into this chilling case, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because on this channel we uncover the darkest truths hidden behind closed doors. Keon Lattimore had always been a man of discipline, honor, and unwavering commitment. A staff sergeant in the U.S. Army, he had dedicated 10 years of his life to serving his country, surviving grueling training, multiple deployments, and the harsh realities of war. He had seen things most men could never stomach: villages turned to rubble, brothers in arms torn apart by explosions, the agony of mothers screaming over the bodies of their fallen sons. War had a way of hardening a man, but for Keon, there had always been one thing that softened him: his wife, Tiana. Keon and Tiana's love story had started long before his military career. They were high school sweethearts, inseparable from the moment they met. He was the quiet but determined star athlete with dreams of enlisting, and she was the beautiful, headstrong girl who swore she'd wait for him, no matter where the army sent him. Their relationship had survived long distances, late-night calls that ended in tears, and the unbearable ache of missing birthdays, anniversaries, and even the birth of their son, Keon, while Keon was deployed overseas. Through it all, Keon believed in Tiana. She was his anchor, the one thing that kept him going when he was thousands of miles away in a combat zone, wondering if he'd ever make it home. To the outside world, they were the perfect military family. Tiana embodied the role of a devoted army wife, holding down the home front while Keon was away. She raised their son, attended military spouse functions, and made it seem as though she had fully embraced the sacrifices that came with being married to a soldier. Friends and family admired them, often calling their love unbreakable despite the challenges they faced. But Keon knew better. Something had changed. Tiana wasn't the same woman he had left behind each time he deployed. She had become distant, guarded, and increasingly hard to read. There were late-night phone calls she quickly silenced when he walked into the room, text messages she never let him see, and nights when she claimed to be at her sister's house but wouldn't answer her phone. At first, Keon told himself it was nothing. He was a soldier, paranoia came with the job. But deep down, a voice in the back of his mind whispered that something wasn't right. What Keon didn't know was that the betrayal ran far deeper than he could have ever imagined. Richard Rico Covington had been more than just a friend, he had been Keon's brother-in-arms. They had met in basic training, pushing each other through grueling drills, standing side by side as they transformed from ordinary men into soldiers. They had been deployed together, fought together, and had even saved each other's lives more than once. Rico had taken a bullet for Keon during a firefight in Afghanistan, and Keon had carried him on his back through enemy fire to safety. Their bond was unbreakable, or so Keon believed. Rico had been a regular presence in Keon's home. Whenever Keon was away, Rico made sure to check in on Tiana and Keon, a gesture that Keon had always appreciated. He had trusted Rico with his family, believing that if anything ever happened to him, his best friend would look after them. But Rico had done more than look after them. For years, behind Keon's back, Rico and Tiana had carried on an affair, sneaking around, sharing stolen moments, and weaving an intricate web of deception. It wasn't just a fling, it was something deeper, something that had been festering beneath the surface for a long time. Rico had crossed the ultimate line. He had betrayed both his brother-in-arms and the code of loyalty they had sworn to uphold. Keon had spent years in war zones, dodging bullets and bombs, always on high alert for enemies lurking in the shadows. But the real enemy had been in his own home all along. And when the truth finally came to light, it would unleash a rage more destructive than anything he had ever faced on the battlefield. Keon Lattimore had spent 18 months in Afghanistan, counting down the days until he could finally return home. Every deployment tested his endurance, his willpower, and his ability to keep his emotions locked away. He had seen men lose their minds out there, break under the weight of war, but he had always held on. He had told himself that no matter how bad things got, he had something waiting for him, a wife who loved him and a son who looked up to him. That was his anchor, the one thing that kept him from drowning in the horrors of combat. So when his boots finally hit American soil, when he stepped off that plane and into the arms of his wife and son, he expected to feel relief. He expected joy, warmth, the feeling of home washing over him. Instead, something felt wrong. Tiana's hug was stiff, her kisses felt forced, and Keris, his little boy who used to run into his arms without hesitation, stood back, looking unsure, almost nervous. Keon tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just the adjustment period. He had been gone a long time, and maybe they just needed time to settle back into their routine. But the feeling in his gut, the same instinct that had saved his life more times than he could count, told him that something was off. Rico had been avoiding him. That, more than anything, sent alarm bells ringing in Keon's mind. Rico was supposed to be his brother, his right-hand man. Normally, the second Keon got back from a deployment, Rico would be the first one at his doorstep with a bottle of whiskey, ready to celebrate his homecoming. But this time, Rico wasn't around. He had sent a few half-hearted text messages, made weak excuses about being busy, but Keon could sense it, something was different. Tiana had changed, too. She barely looked him in the eyes anymore, always keeping herself occupied with something, laundry, cooking, Keris, anything to avoid sitting down and talking to him. At night, she turned away from him in bed, claiming exhaustion. Keon tried to ignore it, tried to chalk it up to stress, but the distance between them was impossible to ignore. Then came the night that changed everything. It had started off as an ordinary night. Keon had finally managed to get Rico to come over, deciding that if his best friend wasn't going to make an effort, he would bring the effort to him. They had done this 100 times before, drinking, reminiscing about the old days, talking about the kind of things only soldiers understood. But this time was different. Rico was drinking harder than usual. He wasn't his usual cocky, loud self. He was fidgety, quiet, and every time Keon looked him in the eye, he looked away. Keon didn't say anything at first, but the longer they sat there, the heavier the silence became. He could feel something building, something neither of them wanted to say out loud. And then, somewhere between the 5th and 6th shot, Rico broke. It didn't happen all at once. It started with a mumble, an incoherent mix of words that Keon barely caught. But when he pressed, when he leaned in and told Rico to speak up, the words hit him like a bullet. "I gotta tell you something, man. I fucked up." Keon froze, his entire body tensing. He didn't speak, didn't breathe. He just stared at Rico, waiting. Rico ran a hand down his face, his fingers shaking. His voice cracked when he finally said it. "I've been fucking Tiana, for years." Silence. A long, deafening silence. Keon didn't move. He didn't blink. His mind refused to process the words, refused to accept the betrayal staring him in the face. Years. Not a mistake. Not a one-time thing. Years. His best friend. His wife. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, all he saw was red. But Rico wasn't done. "There's more," Rico muttered, voice barely above a whisper. "Keris, he's mine." Keon's entire world shattered in an instant. The rage that had been bubbling under the surface erupted like an explosion, and before he knew it, his fist was colliding with Rico's face. Rico barely had time to react before Keon was on top of him, fists flying, years of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak pouring out in every punch. Rico tried to fight back, but Keon was stronger, fueled by something far more powerful than drunken regret. By the time Teyana ran into the room, screaming for them to stop, Rico was already on the ground, blood pouring from his nose and mouth. Keon stood over him, chest heaving, knuckles raw, eyes filled with something dark and unrecognizable. Teyana was crying, trying to pull Keon away, but he barely registered her presence. All he could hear was Rico's voice echoing in his head. Kyries is mine. The child he had raised. The boy he had sworn to protect. His son. Except, he wasn't his son at all. Keon staggered back, his mind racing, his entire reality crumbling. He looked at Teyana, his wife, the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his life. Tell me he's lying, Keon said, his voice hollow. Teyana didn't answer. She just sobbed, shaking her head, but saying nothing. That was all the confirmation he needed. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Keon demanded a DNA test, even though deep down, he already knew the answer. He barely spoke to Teyana, barely looked at her. He couldn't. He had spent his life fighting enemies on foreign soil, but he had never expected the real enemy to be lying next to him every night. When the results finally came in, he stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity. 0% probability of paternity. Kyries wasn't his son. The truth was undeniable now. The family he thought he had was a lie. The woman he had devoted his life to had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. And the man he had called his brother, the man whose life he had saved, had been the one to take everything from him. Keon had been trained to control his emotions, to suppress his pain, to stay calm under pressure. But this? This was a war he wasn't sure he could survive. Keon sat in the dimly lit living room, gripping a glass of whiskey so tight his knuckles turned white. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, each second stretching into eternity. His mind replayed everything, every lie, every moment of deception, every time he had kissed Teyana and told her he loved her, believing she was faithful. The rage simmered just beneath the surface, controlled, but barely. He had spent his life dodging bullets, walking through war zones, and surviving the unimaginable, only to come home and find that the enemy had been in his own bed all along. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was the years of deceit, the stolen fatherhood, the humiliation of raising another man's son while being called daddy. The thought of it made his stomach churn. The DNA test lay on the table, an open wound he couldn't ignore. 0% probability of paternity. That was the cold, irrefutable truth. Kyries, the boy he had loved with all his heart, wasn't his. The weight of it crushed him, but the anger kept him breathing. He heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. The front door opened. Teyana walked in, humming softly, her purse slung over her shoulder. She tossed her keys on the counter and barely glanced at him before heading toward the bedroom. Sit down, Keon said, his voice eerily calm. She froze. Something in his tone made her hesitate. Slowly, she turned to face him. What's wrong? She asked, but there was a slight tremor in her voice. Keon didn't speak. Instead, he slid the DNA results across the table toward her. Her eyes flicked down, reading the bold black letters. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she was completely still, and then, her face drained of color. Keon, Shut up. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Teyana's lips quivered. Baby, please, I can explain. Explain. Keon's laugh was hollow, dead. Explain what? How you let me love a child that wasn't mine. How you let me believe I had a son while you spread your legs for my best friend. Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen. Bullshit. I was lonely. You were always gone. Enrico, he was there, he Keon slammed his fist on the table, making her jump. Don't you dare blame this on me. I was out there fighting for us. For you. And the whole damn time, you were screwing my best friend? Tiana took a step back. I love you, Keon. I swear. Cerise loves you. That's what matters. Keon's face twisted in fury. Don't say that to me. That boy ain't mine, and you knew it. You knew it, and you still let me believe it. His voice cracked, the betrayal cutting deeper than any wound. Tiana reached out for him, but he recoiled like her touch burned. Keon, we can work through this. Please. His hand moved before he even thought about it. He grabbed her wrist, gripping it tight. Work through what, Tiana? Huh? You think I can just forget this? She whimpered, trying to pull away, but he wouldn't let go. I gave you everything, he whispered, his eyes dark with fury. And you threw it away for him. His grip tightened, and she gasped. Keon, you're hurting me. He let go, shoving her back. She stumbled, hitting the counter. Her eyes darted toward the front door, calculating escape. Keon saw it. He saw the fear in her eyes. And it only fueled his rage. His hand moved to the kitchen drawer, fingers wrapping around cold steel. The weight of the gun was familiar, comforting. Tiana's eyes widened in horror. Keon, no. He raised the pistol. Keon, please. I'm sorry. She raised her hands, backing away. Think about Cerise. He needs me. Keon's hands were steady. His voice was ice. No. He needed a mother who wasn't a lying whore. Tiana sobbed. I love you. His finger squeezed the trigger. The first shot hit her in the shoulder, sending her crashing against the wall. Blood splattered across the white paint, bright red against the sterile background. She let out a choked scream, clutching at the wound. Keon stepped closer, his expression blank. She tried to crawl away, her body shaking. Please, please, Keon. Another shot. This time, the bullet tore into her stomach. She gasped, her hands shaking as they pressed against the wound, her own blood spilling through her fingers. She looked up at him, eyes full of pain, of betrayal, of desperate pleading. Keon tilted his head, watching as she struggled, as the life drained from her body. He thought about the nights he had spent missing her. The sacrifices. The love. The lies. He aimed one last time. The final shot hit her in the head. Her body slumped forward, lifeless. Blood pooled around her, soaking into the carpet. The silence that followed was deafening. Keon stood there, staring at the woman he had once loved. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. Then, a sound. A small gasp. He turned. Cerise stood at the top of the stairs, his tiny face pale, his eyes wide with shock. Mommy. The boy's voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with confusion and fear. His little hands gripped the railing, his body frozen in place. Keon felt something inside him shatter. Cerise wasn't his son. But in that moment, looking at the boy's tear-filled eyes, he realized something far worse. Cerise didn't know that. To Cerise, Keon was daddy. And now, he was the man who had just murdered his mother. Keon stared at the blood pooling around Tiana's lifeless body, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The silence in the house was suffocating, wrapping around him like a noose. His ears still rang from the gunfire, but the loudest sound was the small, broken voice behind him. Mommy. Cerise's whisper sent a chill through Keon's spine. He turned slowly, his hands still trembling, his fingers sticky with blood. The boy stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his small chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. Keon opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he explain this? Keres took one shaky step forward, then another, his big brown eyes locked onto his mother's motionless body. The confusion on his face twisted into something deeper, fear. "Mommy?" He said it again, louder this time, as if his voice alone could bring her back. Keon's grip on the gun loosened. The weapon slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floor. The metallic sound jolted Keres, who flinched violently. His lip quivered. His small hands clutched the wooden railing. "Daddy?" His voice cracked, uncertain, searching for the man who had always been his protector. Keon's chest ached. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of what he had done crushed him. Sirens blared in the distance. The neighbors must have called the cops. Red and blue lights flickered outside the windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. Keon didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't even blink when the pounding on the door started. "Police! Open up!" Keres let out a terrified sob, backing away toward the wall. His entire world had shattered in an instant. His mother was gone, and now, his father, the only father he had ever known, was about to be taken from him too. The door burst open, splinters flying. Officers rushed in, guns drawn, voices shouting commands. "Get on the ground. Hands where we can see them." Keon didn't resist. He sank to his knees, hands raised, his face blank, hollow. An officer grabbed his wrists, yanking them behind his back. Cold steel cuffs snapped around them, locking in place. Keres let out a heart-wrenching wail as he watched his father, his hero, get dragged away in chains. Keon didn't fight. Didn't speak. Didn't struggle as they read him his rights. His eyes remained on the blood-stained floor where Tiana lay, the DNA test still clutched in his hand. The words blurred together, but the meaning remained clear. 0% probability of paternity. She had lied. Stolen his fatherhood. Taken everything from him. And now, she was dead. The officers hauled him toward the door. As he passed by Keres, their eyes met one last time. The boy was crying, his tiny hands shaking as he clutched the fabric of his pajamas. Keon opened his mouth to say something, to offer some kind of reassurance, but what was there to say? That he was sorry. That he still loved him. That none of this was his fault. The words never came. The last thing Keon saw before being shoved into the back of the squad car was Keres collapsing onto the stairs, sobbing for a mother who would never answer, and a father who would never come home. Rico Covington sat in his car outside his apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, news alerts, missed calls, text messages piling up. He already knew. The second he heard about the shooting, he knew. He had felt guilt before, but nothing like this. Keon had snapped. Tiana was dead. Keres was alone. And it was his fault. His stomach churned. He had betrayed his best friend, stolen the one thing Keon cherished most, and now, it had all come crashing down in the worst way possible. The cops would come for him soon. But Rico wasn't going to run. He grabbed his phone, took a deep breath, and dialed. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Richard Covington, he said, his voice shaking. I need to turn myself in. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras flashing as Keon Lattimore was led inside in his orange jumpsuit, wrists shackled. Spectators whispered among themselves, divided between those who saw him as a betrayed husband who had been pushed past his limit and those who believed he was nothing more than a murderer. Tiana's family sat in the front row, their faces tight with grief and anger. Keres was absent, shielded from the chaos, now living with Tiana's sister. Rico was there too, his face unreadable, sitting with his own attorney, knowing that his testimony could determine whether Keon would ever see freedom again. The trial became a media sensation. News outlets dissected every detail: Keon's military service, his tours in Afghanistan, his mental health, and, most of all, the devastating betrayal that had set everything into motion. Keon's defense team leaned hard into PTSD. They called expert witnesses who described the psychological damage of combat, the emotional strain of long deployments, and the way infidelity could act as a catastrophic trigger for someone already suffering. They painted Keon as a man who had given everything for his country, only to return home and find that his entire life had been a lie. The prosecution was relentless. They reminded the jury that while Keon had been betrayed, he had made a choice, a brutal, calculated choice to execute his wife in cold blood. They showed crime scene photos, played the 911 call, and replayed the body cam footage of Keon sitting motionless, covered in blood, the DNA results still clutched in his hands. Rico took the stand, his presence sending a ripple through the courtroom. The betrayal that had started behind closed doors was now on full display for the world to see. He testified about the affair, admitted that it had been going on for years, but claimed he never meant for things to end like this. He spoke about the moment he learned Tayana was dead, the guilt that consumed him, and the choice he made to turn himself in. Keon stared at him the entire time, his face void of emotion. When it was time for Keon to testify, he hesitated for a long moment before standing. His voice was even, controlled. He spoke about his deployments, the horrors he had seen, the toll it had taken on him. He described the moment he learned Kiriz wasn't his son, the weight of that betrayal crushing him, and how everything inside him simply broke. "I wasn't thinking," he said quietly. "I wasn't even there. I was somewhere else. A different battlefield." The jury deliberated for days. Public opinion was split. Social media erupted with debates. Was Keon a broken man who deserved leniency, or was he a murderer who needed to pay for his crime? When the jury returned, the air was thick with tension. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." Gasps filled the courtroom. Tayana's mother burst into tears. Keon didn't flinch. The judge sentenced him to 40 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25. As he was led away, he looked toward the gallery one last time. His eyes locked onto Rico, who stared back, his expression unreadable. And then Keon was gone, swallowed by the justice system, leaving behind a shattered life, a divided nation, and a son who would grow up without a mother or a father. Keon sat on the hard prison cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a steel cage within the one he was already trapped in. The nights were the worst, silent, except for the occasional distant screams of other inmates. That was when the memories crept in. The way Tayana's eyes had gone wide with fear, the way Kiriz had stood frozen, staring at his mother's lifeless body. He had lost everything. His home. His career. His son. And for what? A woman who had never truly loved him. A friend who had shattered every bond of trust. He had spent years surviving war zones, only to be taken down by the people he trusted most. Outside prison walls, Rico tried to pick up the pieces. The world had turned against him. Online, he was branded as a homewrecker, a coward who had destroyed a family. No one saw him as the victim. He was free, but everywhere he went, people whispered. Tayana's family cut him off from Kiriz completely, refusing to let the boy be raised by the man responsible for his mother's death. And Kiriz, he was the real victim in all of this. A child without a mother. A child whose father was locked away for decades. One day, he would learn the truth. Would he see Keon as a broken man who had made a terrible mistake? Or as a monster who had murdered his mother? Keon didn't know the answer. All he knew was that the rage had left him, and in its place, there was only silence. One moment of anger. One life lost. And a betrayal that could never be undone. Was Keon a man pushed too far, or had justice been served? That was the question that would be debated for years to come. But for Keon, the answer no longer mattered. His fate was sealed. Betrayal is a powerful force, one that can break even the strongest of minds. Keon Lattimore was a decorated soldier, a man who had survived war, only to be destroyed by the people he trusted most. One moment of uncontrollable rage, and his life was reduced to a prison sentence, his future stripped away. But in the end, was he truly the only one who lost? Teyana paid the ultimate price for her deception. Rico, though free, lived with the stain of his actions, his reputation forever ruined. And Carice, the innocent child caught in the crossfire, would grow up without a mother or a father, forever haunted by a past he never asked for. This case serves as a chilling reminder that betrayal, when pushed to the extreme, can lead to irreversible consequences. There were no winners here, only shattered lives, broken trust, and a tragedy that never should have happened. What do you think? Should Keon have received a lighter sentence given his PTSD and emotional trauma? Or was justice served? Let us know in the comments. If this story shocked you, like and subscribe for more cases of love, lies, and deadly consequences.